Hello and welcome to Dream Deals, the programme that traces the history of some of the world's most popular cars. Now this week we're in Essex to see why one manufacturer in particular has been able to, over the years, build not only some of the world's best-selling cars, but also some of the most desirable. Worked out who it is yet? Maybe these will help. That's right, this week we're looking at the famous blue oval of Ford. The now legendary Henry Ford established the Ford Motor Company in 1903. The company's home was, of course, Detroit, Michigan, USA, but it wasn't long before Uncle Henry set his sights on the UK. In fact, shortly after the company's inauguration in the States, Ford of Britain was created. Now, over the next couple of years, the company's profile increased thanks to cars like the Model A and the Model N, but there was one car that was staggeringly successful in the United States and encouraged the company to begin production here in the UK. A famous car with a famous slogan. You can have any colour you want so long as it's black. He was a right cad, Henry Ford, wasn't he? It is, of course, the very famous Model T. Although the first Model T was launched in 1908, it wasn't until 1911 that the first British-built Model T rolled off the production line in Trafford Park, Manchester. Over the next few years, sales in the UK flourished, and by the time production ended 16 years later, 300 cars had been produced. Now, the Model T is probably the first supercar, if you like. Because it was so significant, it brought cars to the masses. Now, bold claims have been made about the Model T, but let's not get carried away. It wasn't a car for everybody. It was strictly a car then for the medium well-off, the middle classes, the new industrial classes of the beginning of the 20th century. And, of course, rich frogs, because Toad of Toad Hall, of course, drove one. Pop, pop. Now this car is a little belter. It's got 2 forward gears, 1 reverse gear, and it develops about 20 odd horsepower, and it's a nice tidy little car. Nowhere near as rough as I thought it would be. Obviously you've got quite a bit of shakeage looking at me, but it really is very comfortable because of its leaf springs that make it absorb a lot of the bumps, so it really is a tidy little car. The weirdest thing about this car is that you have to put your foot off the clutch to go faster. So if I want to speed up here, I use my accelerator on the side of the steering wheel and actually put my foot on the clutch to engage the engine. And then hopefully we go a bit faster. I use my accelerator and then I take the handbrake off curiously and then put my clutch right down and then take it off, and then we're in top gear and we're tootling along again, fine styly. Now, unlike modern cars, the Model T of 1925 was largely the same as the Model T of 1909. It had the same 4-cylinder engine, the same straight-sided frame, and the same 3-point leaf springs. The only difference was the way it was made. Now, with over 15 million cars made, it meant that the future for Ford was certainly bright. The only question was now, could they top it? And try they did, because over the next 40 years or so, Ford produced some of the most popular cars in the UK. Who can forget the Anglia, the Prefect, the Consul, and perhaps the most famous of them all, the Zephyr. But despite the success of all of those cars, it was what was to follow that really grabbed the attention of the British public. Launched in 1962 and originally called the Consul Classic and Consul Cortina, the Ford Cortina would go on to become the most successful of cars the company would ever produce, outshining not only other manufacturers but also a rival from Ford of Germany. The British-built and designed Cortina was cheaper, faster and more economical than anything else in its class. Now, although the car was produced until 1982, perhaps the most fondly remembered model was the Lotus-tuned Cortina of 1963. Underneath the car's standard shell was a tuned 1.6 engine and uprated suspension. Although the road-going versions were a little difficult to drive, on the track they were special and unbeatable, with wins in the European Saloon Car Championship and numerous rally events. To continue the success that the company had been enjoying was always going to be difficult. With every new car, there was the chance that the country's love affair with all things Ford could come to an end. But even the most optimistic person at Ford could not have anticipated just how successful the replacement for the Anglia was going to be. Launched in 1968, the Escort looked and was a conventional front-engine, rear-wheel drive car. But what made it stand out was the way it was made, with a new process developed to ensure better fitting panels. Just as at home on the school run as on a muddy hillside, the Escort captured the hearts and minds of the British public. Combining good vehicle dynamics, style and affordability, the Escort was the car to be seen in. And the thing was that the kids who had once been taken to school in the back of their mum's Escort grew up wanting one of their own, only with a little more power. And they weren't to be disappointed, as the Escort came in many sporting guises. There was the Escort RS 1600, the Mexico and the RS Turbo, and of course everyone's favourite, the XR3i. Now over the next 30 years, the Escort would go on to become Britain's favourite family hatch, with everyone from my mum to Princess Diana owning one. But in 1998, time was called and the Escort was retired. Its replacement was a car designed for the millennium, the all-new Focus. Now, whilst we're on the subject of icons, we couldn't possibly let the 70s go by without mentioning the one car that made them worthwhile. But before I reveal it, does this ring any bells?
Believe in me, mate, I was born tall, dark and beautiful. And engagingly modest, of course.
The Professionals! Bodie, Doyle. What do you mean you don't remember? Rolling across bonnets. Well, if you don't remember it, you'll remember this. Launched in 1969, the Capri was hailed as the car you always promised yourself. With its long bonnet and 2+2 styling, the Capri was the Mustang of Europe. But although the styling was all new, the car's underpinnings relied on the Cortina. At launch it was available with a wide range of engines and specifications, but it was the high-performance models that got all the attention. And they didn't get much more powerful than this, the Capri 280 Brooklands. Underneath its now longer and softer looking body was a 2.8 litre V6 engine, generating 160 brake horsepower. Performance, as a result, was impressive. 0 to 60 dispatched in under 8 seconds and a top speed of 127 miles per hour. Now, when the Brooklands first came out, I was just a lanky, spotty 16-year-old with pictures of cars like this on my wall. But now, oh, how things have changed. Now I get paid to drive them on tracks like this for free. Now, the thing about the Ford Capri is that you tend to look at it through rose-tinted spectacles. In other words, the longer you look back at it, the more you think that was a great car, fondly loved by millions. But the truth is, it wasn't really. The truth is, it was a bit of a joke. It was Gary and Dave, who lived down the road, who had sun strips in the windscreen and were going out with Sharon and Tracy. It was the original Essex boy car. But don't let that detract from the fact that the car drives and handles really quite well for something this old. And don't be put off either by the smaller engined Capris. They really weren't worth writing home about. You had to have a V6 and you had to have a 2.8 or a 3 litre engine. Now they were worth writing home about, because they were rear wheel drive, they handled something like a sports car, and they were absolutely brilliant fun. And the other thing about the Capri was that its shape was a beautiful shape, and it meant that all of the styling kits and all the Max Power Brigade, which didn't exist in those days, could really get to grips and soup up your Capri to make it look something special. It was one of the first cars to do that. Everyone would admire the Capri down the road with a great big sports kit on it. It was a 1.6 and couldn't pull the skin off the proverbial, but it still looked fantastic because of its 2+2 coupe shape. It really was striking, and it was one of the most recognisable cars too. There was no mistaking a Capri when it went down the road. Now, sadly, the Capri ceased to be in 1986, but not before 1.9 million cars had been made and sold across the world. Years later, Ford tried to recreate that Capri magic with other coupes like the Probe and the Cougar, but ultimately, it failed. Now, that's all for part one, but do stick around because things get just a little bit hotter in part two, because I'm out in not one, but 3 rally-inspired road cars. I'm out in the Escort Cosworth, the Sierra Cosworth, and the brand new RS Focus to find out if it's as good as everybody says it is. We'll see you in a couple of minutes. Hello and welcome back to part 2 of Dream Deals. Now, on today's show, we're here at the Research and Development Unit of one of the world's biggest car manufacturers, that's Ford. Now, so far in the show, we've seen some of the cars that were made for the masses, but now we're going to take a look at some of the cars that were made for fun.
apparently that should be sport.
Although the company was formed in 1903, Henry Ford's first race car debuted 2 years earlier at Grosse Pointe, Michigan, USA. It was from this maiden victory that Henry gained enough money to set the company up 2 years later. Since that debut victory, Ford have gone on to win 175 Grand Prix, 13 F1 World Driver Championships, 11 Indy 500 winners, 11 Karts Championships, 3 World Touring Car titles and 37 WRC victories. And it was as a result of the company's exploits in the World Rally Championships that these two rally sports, or RSs, were made. Now, even though these two RSs are based on very average cars, the Escort and the Sierra, get them out on the open road and you'll soon discover that they are anything but average. Even before the arrival of the Sierra and Escort Cosworths, Ford had a very distinguished rally career with cars like the Lotus Cortina and Escort RS 1600s and Mexicos, but it was the launch of these two cars that really captured the hearts and minds of enthusiasts. The appeal of the Sierra was obvious. In a straight-line sprint, it could outrun a Porsche 928 up to 60, and it could even give a Ferrari Testarossa a run for its money up to 100. And once you've had your fun in here, there's room for all of the family or taking your mates to the football. So a truly practical car. And as if that wasn't enough, the best thing was that it was 15 grand cheaper than a BMW M5. Now, the Sierra RS Cosworth was an amazing machine for its time. You've got to remember it had 200 brake horsepower, went from 0 to 60 in about 6.7 seconds, and it had supercar challenging performance, all for just over £15,000. Now, that incredible 200 brake horsepower came from a brilliant engine that was highly tuned. It was only a 2-litre 4-cylinder double overhead cam engine, but it meant that it was tuned so highly that you could get 200 brake horsepower. The British touring car engines, which had the similar engine, were tuned to 400 brake horsepower. Now that would have been ridiculous, because this car has got bags of power. Now this car's warmed up a little bit. It claims it can do 0 to 60 in 6.8 seconds, so let's give it some. No problem at all. That's incredible acceleration. All in all, an incredible car for its time. And remember, only £15,500, and it had performance to match cars that were 3-4 times as much money for the time. So the purists didn't care. If you had a Sierra Cosworth, you could take them on and very often beat them. Absolutely amazing. Sadly, time caught up with the Sierra Cosworth, and in 1990 production ended. But with proven success both on and off the track, the Sierra Cosworth had proved to be one of the best value performance cars of all time. But like a phoenix rising from the ashes, the name of Cosworth was to reappear. Only this time it was to be smaller, more powerful, and if possible, even more desirable. Although the Escort had been taking part in the World Rally Championship since 1990, this road-going version only went on sale in the spring of 1992. In standard trim, its 2-litre turbocharged engine put out an impressive 237 brake horsepower, but it was the works rally cars that really impressed, as they could develop anything up to 400 horsepower. Now, the Escort RS Cosworth is one of those cars that you either love or hate. The styling is so in your face, it's virtually there, with its massive rear spoiler. It's got a 2-litre 4-cylinder turbocharged engine with a massive turbocharger, and it'll get the car from 0 to 60 in about 6.8 seconds, which really is mind-boggling for a Ford Escort. It'll do about 140 miles per hour top whack. Now, like other performance Fords, you really do have to remember that you're essentially in a Ford Escort, so all of the plastics abound that you would get in a standard Ford Escort, and it really is quite cheap. But that's the whole beauty of the car. It's cheap and powerful and very, 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 very fast. 6.8 seconds in a Ford Escort. You wondered whether the chassis was up to it, but it is. It's a little rattly and a little shaky, but that's probably just to do with the cabin. The actual chassis with its 4-wheel drive is absolutely fantastic. Now that's where this car comes into its own, in its second gear pulling power. You're just idling along, drop it into second, put your foot down, and the car fair takes off. With that four-wheel drive system gripping the road, it has incredible amounts of grip. Even here on the wet test track, the car is gripping absolutely brilliantly. It's gripping me. Crikey. Now, despite the obvious talents and charms of the Escort Cosworth, spiralling insurance premiums restricted sales, and in 1995 Ford ended production. But during its short life, the car achieved a great deal. Not only did it win the famous Monte Carlo Rally and several other World Rally Championship events, it further cemented Ford's reputation for making sports and rally cars of note. Whilst it was the RS models that stole most of the limelight, it was the XR models that sold by the bucket load. With respectable rather than blistering performance, models like the Escort XR3i and Fiesta XR2i were the dream cars of wide boys and Essex girls everywhere. But it was this popularity that ultimately led to the brand's demise after 20 years. With rising insurance premiums, the people the cars were aimed at could simply no longer afford them. In 1994, the XR brand disappeared. Hype is a very dangerous thing. To hype a car up to a car-buying public that includes the RS Owners Club that are prepared to believe every single word is playing with fire. After not months, but years, the Focus RS finally arrived at the tail end of last year, and it was one of the most eagerly anticipated car launches of recent times. The entire male population of Essex was on Valium. Fingernails were bitten down to flesh, and Ford, well, they just lit the bright blue touch paper, crossed their fingers and stood back. So, what was the verdict? The car is said to be inspired, of course, by the Focus RS of the World Rally Championships, but, well, it's a funny word, that, inspired. I might be inspired by Ruud van Nistelrooy, but trying to play football like him is another matter. I play football like Dick Van Dyke. From the outside, the RS is truly stunning and has more than a passing resemblance to its world-conquering all-terrain munching cousin. The stance is much more squat than the standard car, and it has bite-your-legs-off styling all round. And the components too are made by the same people as on the WRC car. The wheels are made by Oz, the brakes by Brembo, the seats by Sparco, etc, etc. So, how good is it? Was it worth the wait? Was the hype justified? And just how inspired by the WRC car is it? Do you know, I've just had a thought. That last bit about just how inspired is this car by the WRC vehicle, well, I can't answer that because I've never driven one. But the rest, I'll give it a go. When Ford put the incredible Escort Cosworth out to stud all of those years ago, they did promise us a 300 horsepower four-wheel drive replacement. Well, someone had their fingers crossed, because what they've delivered is a front-wheel drive 212 brake horsepower car, and they made us wait a very long time. But they may have delivered late, but boy have they delivered. Firstly, there's the engine, a super-sounding 2-litre 4-cylinder turbocharged unit that doesn't sound dissimilar to its esteemed cousin, the Escort Cosworth. It'll really sing for you up in the high revs. It's not quite as stunning as the incredible VTEC from Honda, but musical and inspiring nonetheless. The overriding joy of this engine definitely resides in the mid-range. Down at the bottom there is significant turbo lag, and at the top end it doesn't feel too comfy either. But in the mid-range, between 3.5 and 6,000 revs, and with clever use of the throttle and the brilliant 5-speed gearbox, you get a huge amount of torque, enough to last Parky a lifetime of shows. Now, there was controversy, to say the least, when Ford announced that the RS was going to be driven only from the front. The car was supposed to challenge the Audi S4s, Evos and Imprezas of this world, all of which have 4 feet to run with. But Ford have simply said it doesn't need it. Well, they would say that, wouldn't they? Now, reading between the lines on the four-wheel drive issue, it seems that there was huge problems getting power to the rear of the car that involved a lot more design and a lot more cost, which is why Ford say they don't need it. But all of those other cars that we mentioned, the Audi S4, the Impreza and the Evo, all have four-wheel drive, so you pays your money, you takes your choice. And to a degree, it doesn't need four-wheel drive, because on a nice smooth surface, the RS has an incredible amount of grip. There's also a noticeable absence of wheel spin, despite the absence of traction control, although put your foot down hard over some crests and there's a disappointing amount of torque steer, which would be eliminated if there were 4 wheels powering it. But that's being picky. Considering the power onslaught going through to the front, the car performs brilliantly. But get the car on anything other than a nice smooth A-road and you start to notice where the Focus is, well, not a letdown, but let's just say irritating. That's a polite way of saying it, because hit a pothole or a minor bump at speed and the car will deviate and you have to go routes that you wouldn't have thought possible, let alone planned. The car has got a mind of its own at speed and you need to keep both hands firmly on the steering wheel when you're driving at speed. But this car is all about performance and handling. That 2-litre 4-cylinder engine might not sound like much, but with that huge turbocharger, it generates 212 brake horsepower, enough to get this little car from 0 to 60 in under 6 seconds and onto a top speed of 144 miles per hour. So, was this car worth waiting for? Oh boy, yes. Was the hype justified? Well, probably. Although to keep mentioning this RS in the same breath as the WRC Focus is to get just a little bit carried away. But boy and girl racers the world over, and especially in Essex, will love this car. And some boy racers like me that got older and fatter, they'll love it too. Well, sadly, that's all we've got time for on this week's edition of Dream Deals, but join us at the same time next week when we'll be giving marks out of 10 to another mark of distinction. We'll see you later.